Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the moment your salary hits your hands, it has already started to die. Not slowly, not over months or years, but in the time it takes to walk from the factory gate to the nearest shop. That was the reality millions of Germans faced in 1923. But what most people do not realize is that the famous hyperinflation, the wheelbarrows of cash, the trillion-mark notes, the scenes of chaos, was actually the final chapter, not the beginning. The true collapse started earlier, quietly, inside the Reichsbank itself. Long before prices began to double daily, the central bank had already broken. Its collapse was not just an economic failure, it was a choice, a patriotic mission, and ultimately a fatal decision that pushed a modern nation into economic darkness. To understand how this happened, we have to step back into the suffocating aftermath of World War I. Germany walked out of that war defeated, humiliated, and stripped of the basic tools needed to function as a modern state. The Treaty of Versailles was not simply a peace agreement. It was an economic sentence. Reparations were set at levels Germany could not hope to meet. Key industrial regions were lost, gold reserves were depleted, foreign credit evaporated. Germany was forced to survive without the oxygen that keeps a monetary system alive. Inside this pressure chamber stood Rudolf Havenstein, president of the Reichsbank. He was a traditional banker, trained in a world of gold-backed sound money, yet he woke up in a reality where gold was gone, foreign exchange was impossible to acquire, and the government demanded financing at any cost. Havenstein did not see printing money as reckless. He saw it as fulfilling his legal and patriotic duty. The Reichsbank's charter required him to provide the government with the funds it requested. If the government wrote an IOU, the bank was obligated to turn it into money. Havenstein believed that the state must not be allowed to fail, and if printing money kept the state alive, then printing money became a form of national service. Few documentaries explain this clearly. The Reichsbank was not independent. It could not say no. Germany's government had the legal right to demand unlimited financing, and Havenstein had a legal obligation to provide it. What began as a financial tool soon became a trap. The government issued IOUs. The Reichsbank printed money. The new money raised prices. Rising prices forced the government to demand even more money. And every new batch of money weakened the currency further. It was a conveyor belt with no emergency stop button, and it was accelerating. Then, in early 1923, the machine snapped. French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, to force payment of reparations. Germany, unable to resist militarily, responded with a strategy called passive resistance. Workers in the Ruhr were ordered to stop working. Trains would not run. Mines would not operate. Factories would not produce. Germany declared an economic strike against the occupying forces and promised to pay every striking worker their full wages for as long as the crisis lasted. But a nation on strike still must eat. It still must heat its homes and buy daily necessities. Millions of workers were producing nothing, yet receiving wages. Thousands of businesses were losing money, yet still paying taxes. The German government suddenly needed a river of money far larger than anything seen during the war. Where could that money come from? Havenstein had only one answer: print. The presses roared to life at a speed no one had imagined. New banknote designs were rushed into production. Paper stocks ran out. The government began buying any material it could find to print money on. Cheap newsprint, low-quality pulp, even leftover scrap from warehouses. Private printing companies were hired. Notes were churned out so fast that ink sometimes smeared onto the hands of the people receiving them. This was not yet hyperinflation. This was the prelude, the collapse before the collapse. Prices were rising rapidly, but the psychological shock had not yet spread nationwide. Still, the signs were everywhere. A loaf of bread that cost a few hundred marks months before suddenly cost thousands. Then, tens of thousands. Farmers began refusing to bring food into the cities because paper money was improving no one guessed life. Industrialists struggled to plan production because input costs changed hourly. Germany was starting to unravel thread by thread. For ordinary people, the unraveling was not theoretical. It was lived every day, every hour. Savings that families had kept for generations evaporated. Pensions promised to veterans became meaningless. War bonds sold as patriotic investments were now worthless souvenirs. A paycheck that looked generous on Monday could barely buy groceries by Friday. The reasonable thing to do was no longer reasonable. People began racing against time itself. The moment they were paid, they had to spend. Not because they wanted luxuries, but because waiting even a few hours meant their money would lose value. Women stood outside shops waiting for prices to be updated, hoping they could buy flour before the afternoon adjustment. Landlords demanded rent in advance. Barbers raised prices mid-haircut. Workers asked to be paid twice a day. A stable society had become a panicked marketplace where money itself had turned into a hot potato. Havenstein, trapped in his own logic, believed the cure was more money. If prices rose, he reasoned, people needed more cash to function. If the economy was strained, banks needed more liquidity. If wages were insufficient, workers needed larger notes. He looked at the crisis and saw scarcity, not rejection. He believed that Germans lacked enough money to maintain daily life. In reality, they had too much money. Money no one trusted. By the middle of 1923, the financial system had lost all coherence. The government could no longer collect taxes in any meaningful way. By the time taxes were paid, the money received had already lost value. Public servants could not be effectively paid. Local governments struggled to buy fuel. Schools could not purchase basic supplies. The only institution still functioning was the printing apparatus, which was now a national emergency service. Trains ran not to carry passengers, but to deliver crates of newly printed banknotes across the country. Security escorts were needed because the paper itself became more valuable than the currency printed on it. Then the numbers broke reality. Denominations jumped from thousands to millions, from millions to billions, and from billions to trillions. Banknotes were printed only on one side to save time. Notes were so worthless that children used them as wallpaper. People burned stacks of money in stoves because it was cheaper than buying wood. Foreign visitors purchased entire restaurants or apartment buildings with the equivalent of a few dollars. The German middle class, once the backbone of the nation, was wiped out so completely that many families never recovered. Throughout this chaos, political extremism flourished. Bavaria drifted toward independence, the Rhineland entertained the idea of secession, communist groups prepared uprisings. In Munich, an unknown political agitator named Adolf Hitler watched the disorder with fascination. He understood that when a society loses its faith in money, it begins to lose faith in everything. By the fall of 1923, Germany was not just economically broken, it was psychologically broken. The Reichsbank itself was barely functioning. Staff worked around the clock, exhausted, overwhelmed, and increasingly hopeless. Havenstein, who had dedicated every breath to keeping the system alive, became a tragic figure. He was blamed for the crisis, yet he believed he had done his duty. He died in November 1923, just as the currency he had spent years defending finally collapsed into nothing. The man who printed money to save his country was consumed by the very crisis he tried to prevent. And then, in one of history's most improbable miracles, the German government reset the system almost overnight. They introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed not by gold, but by a national promise. It was said to be backed by German land and industry, not redeemable, not exchangeable, but symbolically linked. In truth, it was held together by psychology. Germans were desperate for stability. They were exhausted by chaos. They were ready to believe in anything that might restore order. Within weeks, prices stabilized. Hyperinflation ended, confidence returned, not because the math changed, but because belief returned. The miracle of 1923 was not economic. It was psychological. The real lesson of 1923 is not in the numbers. It is in the months before the explosion, when the system was technically running, but spiritually dying. Collapse did not begin when prices became absurd. Collapse began when trust cracked, when institutions lost credibility, when leaders clung to old rules in a new world, when money was printed faster than meaning, and when a nation convinced itself that more paper meant more hope. Currencies do not die when they run out of value. They die when people stop believing the story behind them. That is the silent moment when collapse begins. If you want more deep dives into the hidden layers of financial history, subscribe to Financial Historian 2.0 and let us know in the comments where you were watching from. The global reach of this community has been incredible. Remember this: currencies don't die when numbers get big, they die when trust gets small.